So moving on.
Happy to have you with me and me with you. And I'm going to trust Colleen and Scott to give me the hook at the appropriate time, but I'll try to watch the clock a little bit here too. I'm pretty excited to be able to share this story with you this afternoon about how private land conservation, particularly private land trusts, are increasingly using GIS for some very strategic initiatives that they're taking on relative to a topic that I think we all are more and more concerned about these days and what we can do about it, specifically climate change. And you can see that at one of the main panels on Gathering Water's websites. I think it will help some people that may not be familiar with land trusts and private land conservation to just sort of set the stage a little bit. So I've got a couple slides to do that. The organization that I'm secretary of these days, Gathering Waters, is a Madison-based service organization for land trusts in Wisconsin. In some ways parallel to WLIA, it works directly with its members to help support their activities, and also does do advocacy at the state level to help support funding programs, specifically the Knowles Nelson Stewardship Program that many of you may be familiar with or at least heard of, and advocating for its continued availability, which is a big driver for success in conservation for both public and private agencies at the local and state level, as well as private land trusts and other organizations. Gathering Waters also focuses on capacity building for land trusts and advocating for land trusts at the state and federal level. Now let's see if I can get the slides to go forward. There we go. Haven't been in full screen mode in quite a while. This slide kind of has two aspects to it. One is the fact that we have now documented the impact of all of our 40+ land trusts members across the state. Holds slightly over 1,800 holdings, 194,000 acres, and as you can see, over twice as many easements as there are fee simple. Easements are a pretty common facility for acquiring interest in land for land trusts with willing owners who retain use of those properties. When I started with Gathering Waters back in 2016, we weren't doing anything with GIS, and we've come a long way in terms of building the resource that was shared on that previous slide, which we call our conservation database. We've actually hired somebody on an ongoing basis to sort of be the parcel manager for Gathering Waters and helping individual land trusts acquire precise boundaries developed with coordinate geometry, even though many of them are easements. He actually goes to the source land records from the counties and collects that data, and then we gather that up and publish it on a periodic basis for use by trusts and at a limited basis for use by other folks as well, university researchers as an example. Another example of how we're using those data in concert with trusts is to help them provide a sort of unified way of making data and information available for which trust holdings are available for public recreation. And here's a good example of a quick story map example of that. Another example is something that's live on the Gathering Waters website these days. So if often a private landowner rather comes to a land trust with some potential idea that they may be interested in conserving their land in some way. And so a lot of that sort of engagement with local landowners and trusts happens in a more reactive way in some cases, but in other cases, the trust spends decades in some cases developing relationships with landowners or family members of landowners. And this is just one additional way that public can find one or more land trusts that work in their area to sort of cooperate with. A couple of years ago, I got tagged in a conversation at a Gathering Waters annual conference to talk with them about helping them get more proactive, more strategic, if you will, embracing climate change. And just wanted to give you a little sense for Landmark. They're actually, a few years ago, the recent merging of West Wisconsin Land Trust and Bayfield Regional Conservancy into a trust now that serves 21 counties and has a ongoing and continuing growth in their holdings and acreage. A little bit about how a private land trust works. They really have two primary missions. One is conserving land or obtaining interest in land via usually fee or easement. In a few cases, it's a different form, but that's a very minor contribution to the overall private conservation estate. And then once those lands have been acquired, either through fee or easement, they need to steward those lands. Some of that may actually be improvements to the landscape or managing of the landscapes. But they also need to, in a land record sense, sort of protect, not so much in a conservation, so they certainly do that, but they also need to protect their interest in those lands. Most states have a sort of private land conservation provision within their state statutes, as does Wisconsin. But most states, many states like Wisconsin, have a provision that those easements need to be actively maintained. And if they aren't within a 20 or 30 year period, they can literally just roll off the books and those easements could revert to the then present landowner. So there's a lot of protection and maintenance done of even just the ownership aspects of conserved land by private land trust. As I mentioned, a lot of the acquisition of lands from a land trust happen through, if you will, more reactive sort of means, not to mean that in a negative sort of way, but a number of land trusts who have robust membership bases and strong boards and have funds to work with, have many more people coming to them than they can handle. But things are beginning to have land trusts get more strategic in how it is that they operate. One of the biggest reasons is the potential for transforming their operations to be more proactive, less reactive. One of the forcing functions for that, of course, is climate change. A lot of smaller land trusts, I should say, there are land trusts that are Gathering Waters members that have maybe a few dozen properties and are conserved for very specific reasons. As an example, one is really just to support the maintenance of horse trails for the use of their members. But then also Gathering Waters members include people like the Nature Conservancy and larger trusts like the Ice Trail Foundation, Landmark, and others who have substantial holdings of their own for conservation purposes. And they are increasingly looking for ways to embrace the notion of climate change being such a strong driving force in the quality and the availability of conservation lands on the planet, that they're motivated to shift gears a bit and apply some of their best efforts towards proactive conservation, and in contrast in the more reactive aspects of that. Not that they won't still take opportunistic offers that have people knocking on them door for by any stretch of imagination, but committing some of their best efforts towards being more proactive and applying analytics to look for opportunities for intact, resilient lands, or I should say lands that are resilient to climate change. And I should spend just a minute just talking about what that means. Resilience in this context doesn't necessarily mean that the land in the face of changing climate isn't going to also change. What's meant by resilience here is having lands which have robust ecological value, the underlying geology, access and nearness of water as an example, rich soils, topographic variability, a range of aspects that together make that land more likely to harbor high ecological values even after climate change occurs, even though the species composition that lives on those lands may be different. So opportunities exist to look for, the quality of the existing lands, but also are there opportunities for a given area of land to be part of a migration corridor so that as species migrate, there are places for them to go to, and the lands that are considered to be highly resilient have the ability to receive, if you will, species that migrate there over time. So Landmark decided on a strategy to proactively go after intact lands, larger chunks of land that are resilient to the effects of climate change. They also committed early on to the idea of using GIS to help determine specific focus areas to target, and use it also to help identify large aggregated parcels that are held by single landowners that have high values for conservation. And they would then use those analytical results to conduct proactive outreach campaigns, if you will, and maybe a sort of a classic sales campaign sort of example, to engage directly with landowners who may very well not have had any interest or knowledge even of the land trust, but to engage with them proactively and help secure resilient lands in a proactive basis before some of those opportunities begin to fade away. So they started in spring of 2019 with a meeting that I attended up in Spooner at the DNR headquarters there, and gathered up about 45 people and had some very interesting and educational experiences by climate change consulting organization that works out of the UP, and someone I worked very close with on this project, Nick Miller, who's the state science advisor for the Nature Conservancy in Madison, and ironically, whose father was my high school choir director. Nick and I had a lot of fun working on this project. Towards the end of the day, we brought people together in small working groups to help identify data sources that people thought would be valuable as ones in which that could facilitate analysis to try and determine where focus areas should be, where were specific areas that people thought were of high importance. And as you can imagine, as many of these were field biologists and ecologists, a lot of the places that were proposed, so to speak, were places that they cared about, that they worked in. And some of them, many of them actually focused on very specific vegetative communities or aquatic animals or terrestrial animals, that sort of thing. But we ended up with a list, even just from the GIS standpoint, over 225 different GIS data sets people identified as being useful through this process. But what resulted from those meetings is the notion of how do you tweeze apart the various, and I refer to it as competing ecological interests. None of them were wrong or bad, they were all really valuable, but how do you sort of lift up the conversation from this fish species or that plant species or this ecosystem, where we can really talk about protecting and conserving large landscapes? And how do we even determine, of all of the data that are available, what are the most important and discerning to use to try and come up with where to help Landmark focus its efforts? And that's where Nick Miller's guidance came into fore and was really important in helping winnow down a strategy that was really useful and could be practically applied in GIS. Conservancy for many years has been developing this concept called conserving nature's stage. And the idea being, geodiversity as a strategy for conservation. So not so much the species themselves, again, as the underlying ecological resources, as I mentioned earlier, soil, topography, landforms, bedrock, and so on. And then focus as much on those physical factors as well as topography and morphology and weather and climate and so on and so forth, existing protected areas and so on, and bring them all together into a set of blended data sources, rasters actually, and they've now completed a draft of these data across the country that is available for web services that they actually expose in their own easy to use applications for people to explore and learn about places that might be really good to address from a conservation standpoint. Nick advised Landmark to focus specifically on two variables, if you will, in the 10 or so layers that TNC produces as a part of this resilient connected landscapes set of layers. The first one is resiliency. That's expressed as a numeric score between about -3,000 and 3,000, with 0 being the point of, if you will, average resiliency. And his guidance to us was to focus on properties that had a positive resiliency score of 500 or greater. Connectedness is expressed also as this sort of, I was going to say scaleless, but that's not appropriate, but not connected to any one particular data source. Connectedness here is a measure of how species could migrate across the landscape if climate change drives them to do so. And that combination of resilience and connectedness were thought to be two very important characteristics of helping an organization like Landmark prioritize their efforts. So that ended up, again, as a little bit of refinement. We also threw Wisconsin DNR's streams and wetlands layers into the mix, as well as captured a sort of snapping of WISC-land data to the statewide parcel map. And we didn't literally apply that to all of the parcels. We were a little bit smart in terms of how we focused that. So we started with the effort of trying to find out these focus areas that Landmark would focus on. And we started with the Wisconsin DNR's conservation opportunities, both the aquatic as well as the terrestrial. Here's a simple map of that. And through a series of about 6 months worth of conversations with various focus groups, some of them based in specific areas, many both current and retired members of Wisconsin DNR and U.S. Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, other agencies, local experts. We finally winnowed down to these 17 focus areas across the state. Again, not that other areas weren't very important. By the way, the little blotches on the map are, at the time, Landmark's existing holdings across these areas. So again, resulting in 17 of these focus areas. So we use those focus areas to then filter out, or filter in, so to speak, parcels from the statewide parcel map. And while we were doing that, we were also looking to whittle out, so to speak, any current publicly held lands. And in addition to using spatial searches based on this list of public holdings, we also did attribute searches. So we eliminated local government held lands and so on. That resulted, and we artificially had a breakpoint of greater than 19 acres. So we had somewhat larger parcels, and that resulted in 26,795 parcels passing the process. At that point, we attached those various attributes to what we called the target parcels. So we brought resilience and connectedness and the WISC land attributes and how much wetlands were contained in a particular parcel, as well as the distance to the nearest protected area as attributes into those parcels. And after we did that, and I just realized I have one slide out of order here, I think. I'll come back to that in a second. What you're seeing by the color gradation on this map is the resilience score. So you can see these sort of greenish blotches in this fine grid popping out, and some of the yellow and the orange of less resilient sites. We then took those individual parcels and aggregated them. We tried a couple different attributes from the statewide parcel database to do this, and turned out that owner address proved to be a really useful way to aggregate individual parcels into what we call aggregated targets. So a target being simply a contiguous block of land owned by one private family. I guess it might be a way to put that. And so then once we had data targets that we had data attached to that would be useful for the filtration process, we used dashboard to consider size, resiliency, nearness to protected areas. We originally did some work with land cover and palestine wetlands, and concluded that the most useful for staff were going to be size, nearness to protected areas, connectivity, and resilience. So this is just a little bit more in-depth, larger scale view of resilience characteristics. You can see all these darker green areas blotching out. Not surprising, many of them are along water courses. And again, a couple of landmarks existing holdings. This is the connectedness data, a little bit more gloppy, if you will, but areas where there is good species potential for migration in the face of climate change. This is the first dashboard that I created for Landmark to simply say, okay, here's all the parcels, the target parcels before aggregation, and just so they could get a sense of what the concentration was of relative levels of resiliency, far above average and slightly above average. So 500 to 1,000, 1,000 to 2,000, and 2,000 above, I think is what the breaks were for that. And then there were some selectors at the top of the dashboard to allow them to choose parcel size, resiliency, distance protected areas, and so on. That eventually evolved into this slightly modified dashboard that we're focusing specifically on the aggregated parcels, the target areas, so to speak. This is in an area called Bibbin Swamp up in northwestern Wisconsin, southeast of Superior, southwest of Bayfield. And the final selector filters that were used over on the left-hand side. In this case, one of the selectors allowed them to focus on a specific focus area and just the targets within that focus area, and then be able to literally just type in the values that they wanted to use. This is a sort of before any of the filters were applied. And you can see on the bottom, you get basic landowner information of the ilk that could literally be copied and pasted from that target list on the bottom into an Excel spreadsheet from which staff can then generate contact letters with landowners. This is just the targets without all the other contextual information to give you a little bit better sense for what the differential opportunities were for individual targets. And you can see, particularly in this area, there are some fairly sizable targets here, several hundred acres in some cases. And then this is the result of applying the criteria over on the left to have what was then resulting at the left. Again, the darkest green properties here are the ones that have the highest resiliency scores, and the ones in the lesser green have somewhat lower scores, but still well above average. Okay, arrow in the right direction, Mike. Okay, so to conclude, the outcomes of this project are that Landmark decided, and frankly, via some funding opportunities, decided to work in the focus areas that are highlighted in the upper, well, in a couple different spots in the map: Lake Superior, South Shore streams, St. Croix and Namakagon rivers, and a couple of their tribs, the upper Namakagon River, Straight Lake area and the upper Eau Claire River and Barrens. And they're really focusing on, mostly at the moment, with St. Croix, South Shore streams, and the upper Eau Claire, where they were able to leverage short-term grant funds to support their efforts there. And they're also doing a lot of coordination with local partners. They started with a meeting I participated in St. Croix River area to focus up with the St. Croix River Association and some other local partners to sort of help amplify their efforts, and Landmark in some cases focus helping them specifically with their efforts on a local basis. So with that, thanks very much for your time. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to take them if we have time.
I think we have time. The SIGs don't start until 4:30. Anyone have any comments or questions?
I actually do. Mike, we have land sale parcels, and sometimes they will come up as county property, but they are on the docket to be sold. I imagine you probably want to know that beforehand.
Oh, if you guys are willing to do that, that would be awesome.
Yeah, we have some or had some in those areas that I see that you marked as a priority.
Yes, no question. And we can certainly point you to some of the data resources that the Conservancy has that are available as services that you could stream into your own apps to be able to overlay those and get a sense for what you think might be some areas. And certainly, I'm sure Erica Lang at Landmark would be happy to work with you to help focus those efforts and get them more knowledgeable on what some of those opportunities are as you progress forward.
We are getting a couple questions in the chat. So Kyle asks, how well does this adapt to a more heavily urbanized area?
That is a great question, Kyle. I'm just now starting a project with Ozaukee Washington Land Trust, much more densely developed, certainly at least on their southern areas, and they are interested in applying the same methodology. The criteria probably will be somewhat different, although they will certainly use the connectedness and the resiliency scores as part of the process, part of the data to inform the process. But they very likely will use some projects that they have in mind, for instance, that will require some restoration, or that have a little bit different values that they are interested in conserving. Really haven't gotten very far in the conversation with them about what those factors would be, but they're very interested in the process that Landmark applied and how it could apply to them. And I have conversations with a couple of other land trusts who are also similarly interested in applying that methodology as well.
Awesome. And another question from Jim G. Is there any consideration for carbon sequestration in the land selected? If so, how is that modeled?
Actually, Jim, that's a great question. Gathering Waters has been working with similar organizations around states around Wisconsin, Iowa for one, Minnesota Land Trust, who in comparison to Wisconsin is a big land trust that works pretty much across the state of Minnesota, and some of our larger trusts. Mississippi Valley Conservancy is one of those, and trying to figure out, of the trusts of our realm, so to speak, of Gathering Waters member trusts who have large land holdings, how we could put cooperative proposals together that could be scaled up enough where carbon sequestration could make a kind of impact that national philanthropic organizations like Joyce Foundation as an example, and others who are proactively going after carbon sequestration projects, but are looking for big scale, millions of dollars of projects, where we could use GIS to help them understand how these various entities could come together in a cooperative manner to have the kind of impact scale of impact that they are looking for. So that's active conversation. There hasn't been a formal proposal put together yet, but those conversations are ongoing.
All right, and I'll do a follow-up to Jim's, and then we'll go back to another follow-up. So could the selection criteria be applied by local land and water conservation agencies to work with private landowners?
They certainly could be. The resilient connected landscapes service layers are available publicly, and Conservancy TNC does have on their website a visualization tool. People can either import a shape file or draw areas around it, and they can get some sense for areas that they're interested in, how they are composed, if you will, from the standpoint of resiliency. If you want to work on them in an analytical sense for yourself, then you really need to, and they do make the data available for download. I turned them into vector data to make it more useful, particularly at a very large scale with individual parcels. Even with some of Gathering Waters member trusts, they have long parcels with thin areas on them, and to get a real sense for how the resiliency data lay over the vector data. In some cases, you really had to do a vector overlay. So there's a little bit of data smashing required to do that level of scale. But if you're doing it more for visual and overlay purposes, that's easily approachable, even using the sort of standard publicly available tools that TNC has on their website.
Thanks, Mike. One more, here's a follow-up. Since this is based on the parcel level, what about the difficulties of phenomenon like river corridors and agricultural fields where parcels don't match up well with landscape features?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Part of that really though comes out as part of the overlay process that I was just talking about, because we took the data down, made it local. I actually represented each 30-meter, if I remember correctly, cell from the Nature Conservancy resilient connected landscape data, and did an average resiliency across each individual parcel. So we ended up with a score of that individual parcel of its relative resilience in comparison to other parcels. So it kind of just they filter themselves out as part of the process. Now that doesn't mean that you could have a 40-acre parcel, half of which is rich verdant maple woods and the other of which is intense agriculture, and it could come up as probably under that 500 resiliency threshold. But for the most part, we didn't find much in the way of those extreme variances within parcels.
Thank you, Mike. I'm not seeing anything else, but we'll give it a couple seconds, and you can, raise your hand or just unmute and ask, or type it in the chat. Otherwise, while we're waiting, if more people want to step up, let Scott get ready to show our ending slides. And hopefully you guys saw in the chat that, Remo, our exhibitor hall, is open. We really want to encourage you to go say just hi to the vendors, play the games that are going on as well. Tonight is the photo contest. Take a picture of what you're doing, and then share it in the Slack channel. Any other questions, anyone? Otherwise, I'll hand it off to Scott. Thank you all for attending today. It was lovely to see so many people.
And if anybody else has detailed questions they'd like me to follow up with, happy to do that.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Great work.
You're welcome, Scott. Thanks, Colleen, Scott, for the hosting.